Show it, man!
2010 was the most infamous year in TNA history. There's no debating that. There was a lot going on, from Hulk Hogan and Bischoff, the failed Monday Night Wars, and Hogan forming his own Immortal faction. But another huge angle that happened that year was the ECW invasion of TNA. This invasion led to ECW getting its own TNA pay-per-view, a storyline which lasted 5 months and it created a lot of missed opportunities. Whilst the whole ECW angle wasn't a bad one, and it did have its moments, it could have been better. It's a faction that represents ECW. And you might be thinking, yeah cool, we get to see some ECW luchadors. Nope. How about some hot women from ECW's past? Nope. Technical wrestling? Nope. Edgy angles? Nope. Well, what the hell do we get then? The Sandman. More like the Sad Man. Nearly all the wrestlers who took part in this angle were similar. They were all large guys who liked to use weapons, but they were nearly all over the hill and not capable of actually putting on a good match anymore. Everybody was 5 or 6 years older since the WWE reunion shows, so it sounds like a disaster waiting to happen. Before we get into this one, please give this one a comment and a share, otherwise you just don't care. Prior to the special pay-per-view show, Rob Van Dam was the TNA World Heavyweight Champion. Some familiar faces turned up on telly to protect RVD from a monster attack. Rhyno, Steven Richards, Raven and Mick Foley had all wrestled in TNA a fair bit over the decade, but now Tommy Dreamer was here with them. Al Snow and Simon Diamond were already TNA backstage agents who'd also joined this crew. It was all played off like ECW was invading TNA as they battled police in the TNA locker room. That was until Dixie Carter revealed that she had invited them. Unfortunately, this was probably the best moment of the entire angle. Things quickly accelerated from here as Dixie couldn't stop singing the praises of the group, and Dreamer couldn't stop crying. When WWE One Night Stand first took place, a lot of the ECW guys got closure, but then they just kept driving the ECW name into the ground and making the ECW guys sad again. They now needed a new closure because WWE ECW had depressed them so much. Dixie agreed to giving them their closure, as long as Dixie didn't have anything to do with it, and Tommy Dreamer would be held responsible. Quickly they ran into legal problems and couldn't use the ECW name, and instead they would have to be called EV 2.0, aka Extreme Violence 2.0, which in my opinion is just a horrible name. They even had Hogan put over the group and talk about how amazing hardcore wrestling is, which you just know was complete BS in the Hulkster's brain. Nevertheless, it was now all agreed upon, and the monthly pay-per-view Hard Justice was renamed to Hardcore Justice and scheduled for August 2010. Unfortunately, due to the quick timing of the announcement, there wasn't much time to form any actual storylines for the pay-per-view. 2 weeks before the show, Raven attacked Dreamer because he's a dick. Raven was angry about Beulah McGillicuddy from ECW and said Tommy's kids should actually be his kids. It's almost a pretty hot angle with well-delivered promos, but then you realise it's Raven and Dreamer in 2010 and it's just a rehash of an ECW storyline for 20 years ago. Oh, it's not quite 20 years ago, shove it. RVD is feuding with Abyss, which is hardly great hype for the pay-per-view. He's supposed to be facing Jerry Lynn on that show. It was difficult because TNA were trying to run their regular show with the TNA storylines whilst at the same time trying to shoehorn in hype for the ECW pay-per-view. There just wasn't enough damn TV time. Hardcore Justice 2010 gives me mixed feelings as a show. The copyright stuff is obviously a funny aspect as everybody tries to spend an entire pay-per-view not saying the letters ECW and at times just giving up.
And you know, there's certain names, there's certain initials that legally we aren't allowed to use. You're so familiar with the ECW talent in the roster that you can fill in the blanks.
I think you just did.
Some guys had to wrestle under different names. It got a bit silly. But on top of the names we've already seen so far, we got the FBI, Kid Cash, Nova, Just Incredible, Spike Dudley, Joel Gertner, Fonzie, Axel Rotten, Balls Mahoney and Sabu, who ended up having to substitute for Jerry Lynn. We also got a cameo from the Gangsters, which was cool. Most people's only memory of the show is New Jack trying to do stuff to Jeremy Borash. It was not a terrible tribute, it was just missing some of the stuff which made ECW edgy, New Jack aside. It felt like a lot of over-the-hill guys fighting who mostly weren't even in shape to be fighting. If it hadn't been for the nostalgia, this show probably would have been more poorly received. Now with Hardcore Justice ending, you might think everything was over. ECW guys were saying goodbye. They had their closure. And then they're jumped by the TNA Fortune faction. Yay, faction warfare in TNA. This was all happening because Ric Flair has a strong dislike for hardcore wrestling. It certainly made for some chaotic television. RVD was quickly written off telly for an attack from Abyss. Just what this faction needed, taking one of the few guys who could still put on a good match away. Some of the lower card ECW guys stuck around for a show or two. Dixie Carter announced that they'd all signed short-term contracts, but the faction gradually shrank by the week until we ended up with the original nucleus of ECW guys from the start. I remember at the time thinking it was strange that guys like Little Guido were shown with new contracts and then they disappeared entirely. Did they get them or not? Some of the ECW guys feuded with Fortune, whilst others feuded with the Monster Abyss in an effort to get revenge for their leader RVD. It did make sense, because Abyss was a TNA guy, but he could have hardcore matches with them. It became clear that the main voices in this war would be Tommy Dreamer, Ric Flair and Dixie Carter. Yep, along with everything else that was going on around this time, this was when Dixie Carter decided that she needed to be an on-screen character constantly. She used her mic time to back up her decision to hire the ECW guys. Randomly, Brian Kendrick debuted with TNA and joined the ECW faction. I guess it was an attempt to try and add a younger guy to the faction who could still wrestle, but I have no idea what the relevance was here. Just add some of the damn luchadors from ECW, they've wrestled for TNA before. Apparently, Kendrick was a replacement for an injured Mick Foley, who had to pretty much sit this storyline out. Doesn't sound like a very good replacement to me. The first pay-per-view following Hardcore Justice was No Surrender, which as it turns out is essentially TNA vs ECW, although it was never actually presented that way. A missed opportunity. 3 of the matches on the card had this flavour. First, Sabu challenged for the X Division title in one of the opening matches. Douglas Williams was the champion. Sabu was unsuccessful, probably due to all the botches in this match, and Williams beats him with the cheap victory. In the middle of the card, we've got Rhyno facing Abyss in a Falls Count Anywhere match, as Rhyno is still trying to gain revenge for what Abyss did to RVD. As it turns out, the match was very tame for these two, and Rhyno loses, another loss for EV 2.0. And in the semi-main event, AJ Styles and Tommy Dreamer have an I Quit match. This one was actually decent and mixed wrestling with hardcore stuff. AJ makes Dreamer quit with a fork to the eyelid, so ECW lose all the matches, so they should now be gone from TNA. Nope. Dreamer begged Fortune for a truce in their war, probably because it was going so badly for him. The amount of mic time that Dreamer got was insane. It was like he was the face of the company or something. Fortune didn't agree to a truce and beat him down, so it continues. I always felt like this whole thing would have worked out so much better if the heel-face dynamic had been flipped. Fortune was somehow the bad guys for protecting their company and being unhappy that a load of old ECW wrestlers were handed out contracts. All of the ECW guys wrestled a similar style as they were all over the hill. A hill style would have suited them better. We did get to see Sabu versus AJ Styles in a ladder match, which is pretty cool, but the match just turns into a mass of bodies interfering, so it isn't the dream match you would have hoped for. It's another problem with this faction, they lose any important match that they have, and Brian Kendrick is just a weirdo. Mick Foley was finally cleared to wrestle and he faced Flair in a match and yet another over the hill shouldn't be in the ring anymore type match. At least the promos were good though. The ECW crew had their final major match at Bound for Glory 2010 as Team ECW comprised of Raven, Rhyno, Sabu, Richards and Dreamer faced Fortune. And I know I spoke about the ECW crew losing most important matches, but this was one that they'd actually win. That was pretty much due to Brian Kendrick helping them win. But Tommy Dreamer winning the match by pinning AJ Styles just didn't sit well with most TNA fans. At Bound for Glory, Hogan also formed his Immortal faction and sided with the Fortune faction to create a super faction. This was bad news for EV 2.0. One of the reasons for Hogan stealing the company was his hatred of Dixie Carter, since she compared ECW to Hulkamania. Come on now Hulk, you said you liked hardcore wrestling. I knew it was BS. At this point, the story took a turn as the angle became about Rob Van Dam being paranoid. Very appropriate for Rob. But basically, Eric Bischoff played him into thinking that someone in the ECW crew was going to betray him. At first, he thought it was Sabu. Then he thought it was Raven. Raven is a known dick, so this would make sense. He also looks like someone's grandma on crack. Dreamer kept pointing out that it's just Bischoff messing with them, as it's not the first time he's tried to destroy ECW. The whole paranoia angle went on for a month. Rob was extremely grouchy and wound up. Dreamer got tired of Rob and challenged him to a match at the pay-per-view to somehow sort out Rob's head. Turning point would be the final pay-per-view where the ECW faction gets matches. RVD and Dreamer have a 16-minute match which nobody really cares about. They use weapons and they're trying, but once again it's a bit of a disappointment. Rob of course wins, but then hugs Dreamer after the match, so I guess because Dreamer did the JOB to ROB, he can trust him again. Fortune also faced Raven, Rhyno, Richards, Kendrick and Sabu. Fortune win this time with Sabu taking the pin. And because Sabu took the pin, he is somehow legitimately fired from TNA. Flair takes great pride in firing him because he hated the Sheik. He says they aren't done removing ECW from TNA. The ECW crew get to say their goodbyes. Rob says this sucks, and Dreamer says Sabu should be a multi-millionaire for the things that he's done. Rhyno just looks miserable the entire time. On the following episode of Impact, we'd find out what was on Rhino's mind as he rushed the ring during a match between RVD and Kazarian. Rhyno attacked Rob Van Dam, revealing himself to be the ECW traitor. Rhyno also crushed Dreamer with a chair to solidify his heel turn. And not to cut away from the storyline here, but AJ and Richards also had a match, and check out this botched Styles clash. I'm surprised Richards can still move today. Raven is next to end up in a match where he's fired if he loses. Because this is a big moment, he gets a pep talk from the remaining ECW guys, and I just have no idea what Brian Kendrick is even talking about.
Raven, this is synchronicity. I was watching out my window today looking for answers, and I saw birds, and they could mean any number of things.
Because somebody needs to give the bird to the Immortals. That's right.
Yeah, because whenever you see the Hawk, you're always going to be a loser. This is almost so bad that it's good. Anyway, in Raven's storied career, much of it actually spent in TNA, he's given a crap 2-minute send-off against Jeff Hardy. And I'm not saying that Raven deserved to beat Hardy at this point in his career, I just think it was a sad way for his TNA career to come to an end. It was like his past accomplishments as the NWA Heavyweight Champion had been ignored, and he was somehow someone who didn't have any history in this company. Hogan fires Raven and gloats about him being fired, and that's him gone.
Quite appropriate for your crybaby crap, Raven. What about me? Wah, wah, wah. What about me? Well, you're fired, Raven. Quote the holster, nevermore.
Tommy Dreamer ain't done though, and he has a very, very, very long promo exchange with Rhyno. The Ball Machine said his TNA contract expired, and none of the ECW guys cared about that. But Bischoff cared and offered him a new contract if he turned on ECW. It was not an easy decision for Rhyno, but he had a family to look after. Rhyno is about to kill Dreamer when Rob makes the save. Despite Rhino's betrayal and his attack on the heart and soul of ECW Tommy Dreamer, they just have them in a street fight on TV and not on a pay-per-view. Surprisingly, Dreamer wins a weak hardcore match. But like an idiot, Dreamer tries to extend the olive branch and pays for his poor choice with a gore through a table. It was sort of a gore. RVD isn't very happy about this and wants a first blood match on pay-per-view. Seems kinda pointless when Rhyno couldn't even beat Tommy Dreamer. I'm not sure what the point even was in turning him heel, he's lost all of his matches. Anyway, Turning Point 2010 is the final stand for EV 2.0. After this, the faction wouldn't be mentioned anymore. Now I do like this match, it's probably the best from the whole ECW thing because they busted out all their big moves. I just feel like there was a story to tell here that they didn't do, and instead it's bogged down with Tommy Dreamer, instead of it being a proper blood feud. RVD obviously wins, and Rhyno is done with TNA for now. So I guess that contract Eric Bischoff had him sign wasn't a very good contract. Was it worth betraying your friends for? Nope. The only other person left in TNA is Richards, who just quietly disappeared before being fired a month later. So it was all a bit disappointing overall. It didn't produce any memorable moments or matches, especially considering it took up 5 months of telly. Too many ECW wrestlers were missing to make this an exciting angle. And I'm not talking about the Hardcore Justice pay-per-view here. The television angle really missed a Joel Gertner, a New Jack, a Mikey Whipwreck, a Fonzie, even James Mitchell would have helped. Because without them, we're just left with a crying Tommy Dreamer to do most of the talking and wrestling. The Fortune faction were right to hate on them because it was yet another group of old guys trying to take spots up on the show. And that's what they were, a group of old men. The Dudley Boys and Taz couldn't even be bothered to deal with this angle and just did their own thing afterwards. It would have really helped to have had some of the ECW women and cruiserweights. That way you don't have to draft in Brian Kendrick, which just felt silly and felt like TNA couldn't be bothered. They did have Kid Cash working some dark matches at this time, so maybe it was supposed to be him. Who knows? Supposedly, according to Russo, Eric Bischoff wasn't sold on the whole ECW thing and thought it was ridiculous that Tommy Dreamer was getting so much TV time and backstage power. I don't know, not many people have actually spoken on this angle. Nothing about this was terrible, but I just don't think it really needed to happen past the Hardcore Justice reunion show because most of what happened afterwards exposed the wrestlers as being past it. ECW is best off left in the past, and if you don't agree with that, I'll beat you up fast.